Next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Gibson, the Director of the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics and the Sun Life Financial Chair in Bioethics, presenting on the topic of AI for Health, Key Ethical Considerations.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you. It's been a really stimulating conversation so far, and I hope that will continue throughout the rest of the afternoon and into tomorrow as well. So what I thought I might be able to do, building on a little bit of what Alison was talking about, I'm going to drill down a little bit with more of a focus on a particular area of application for AI, and that's in the health space. And of course, I'm coming at, that's the space that I know best. I've been working as an ethicist, an ethics teacher, an ethics researcher in this area for my whole academic and professional career. And so it's the sector that I know best. So I'm coming in with sort of a deep knowledge of how healthcare works, and then we have this really interesting introduction of a set of tools and technologies powered by big data, the use of algorithms. And so I'm looking at this as a question of, so what does this mean for health and healthcare? That space that I know really well, and what is it going to do for us? And so I'm signaling this to show the imbalance in sort of my expertise at this point. I know the sector well, not so much the technologies yet, but I think that's the opportunity. And all of us know something about something around all of these topics. And it's so where we can find the convergence in some of that shared knowledge that I think things become really valuable. But one of the things I might flag too is just a starting point. And it's in terms of when I'm thinking about ethics, what am I really thinking about here? So this is a lens I'm going to be bringing. Ethics, from my point of view, is concerned with the values that underlie decisions, actions, approaches, the situations where those values might come into conflict or be in tension, and the appropriate anticipation and resolution of these conflicts in practice. And I think we've heard a great deal of that type of conversation today, that anticipatory, proactive, trying to identify, trying to be clear on where there may be ethical issues arising, and building that into the design and approaches we might take to AI in these spaces. Now, this is where things become interesting, and again, looking through the lens of a trajectory of ethics work, but then also from healthcare, AI is this really interesting opportunity. It is disruptive, and it's disruptive potentially in three ways. I see it within the ethics space right now as disruptive in terms of thinking. So it's disruptive in terms of all of the norms and paradigms of ethics, types of research, or ethics for clinical care or for organizations and systems are being put to the test in a way that other types of innovations, we have not seen the same sort of tensions. So it's forcing us to rethink in certain ways what constitutes an ethically sound approach to the use of technology, such as an AI-based type of technology. So it's really beginning to foster some disruption in terms of ideas. It's also fostering disruption in terms of the sort of thinking about AI as a set of tools and methods which have been hoped for, but we haven't really seen the opportunity until the last few years to really start to realize those. So it's disruptive from that point of view. we've got more tools in our toolkit. That's exciting. And then the third, though, is disruption in starting to think about, so how ought we to apply this, recognizing that some of the tools and methods that we already have may be more than adequate. So how do we start to make some of these distinctions? And so disruption as a creative force is the way I look at this, not disruption as a form of tearing things apart. So this is a really interesting and creative space for AI, but also for ethics. And so one of the inspirations for my interest in this particular area comes from the former Director General of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, who in June 2017, in her opening remarks for the AI for Good Health Summit, commented as follows, that AI is a new frontier. Yes, for us in healthcare, it is a new frontier in many ways. And so, as with many of the technologies that we've been familiar with in the past, we know from experience that often the development and diffusion of these technologies outpaces our ability to identify sound public policies around these, and also to identify where there may be values tensions, ethical issues, or ethical dilemmas that need to be addressed. And so the imperative is to get up to speed and to be proactive and to throw ourselves in and to engage sooner rather than later, and in a way that is engaged as in getting our hands dirty with others as we start to explore this. And we've seen this proliferation over the last few years in particular of ethical principles documents or values documents from various organizations. I'm going to call out right now the Montreal Declaration on Responsible AI as an example. And so there is internationally a conversation trying to set out the minimum specifications, the min specs, if you will, for the use of AI in particular settings. Now, many of these are general in the sense that they're not, so from my point of view, we haven't really articulated what are the ethical principles for AI in health or related to healthcare. So that's a gap that we found. But there has been some research, and actually Professor Florides did some research recently that they looked at 6 different documents, or principles documents, and they found that there were 43 different principles, but they could nest together in 5 or 6 different core commitments. So there is nevertheless a proliferation that is convergent around what seems to be some common values and principles. So the question for me then, as somebody working in the health field, is what does this mean for health? And that is some work that we are only just beginning to think about in concrete sorts of ways, and that's work that needs to be done. So we would think about, for example, where are the opportunities emerging in health that these principles might apply? And indeed, within the application of those principles, where might the conflicts or competing values actually emerge that we need to be aware of? Because many of these principles documents don't prioritize which principles are more important than others. But those of us who work in the ethics field know that, these principles come into conflict because they're both important, or they're all 5 are important. But in certain situations, certain contexts, there may be intention. So some of the areas that we are starting to move towards developing more of a typology, if you will, of applying these ethical principles to flesh out where some of these important ethical issues are in any of these 4 areas. So, for example, we see opportunity emerging in the area of addressing critical service gaps to meet needs. So that can be in the form of carer robots. Well, a really interesting area of scholarship that's been led, particularly out of the Netherlands, fleshing out what some of those ethical issues are there. But more recently, I've been reading about these personal medical assistants. So your symptom checkers, throw in your symptoms and then find out what possible diseases you might have. And often that is seen as a way to bridge geographic gaps in terms of people's access to a health provider, or indeed to ensure that people are not showing up at the emerge department if they should really just take bed rest. But one of the challenges that's emerged with these is that if you take any one of these apps, you throw in your symptoms, you don't always get the same set of recommendations. So some of the worried well that these apps had been partly developed to keep them out of hospital, keep them in their beds, with bed rest, is still bringing them into the hospitals because they're getting competing types of recommendations, more conservative or less conservative ones. We've also heard that there's opportunities, and we know that there are opportunities in terms of diagnostics, and in terms of some of the predictive capabilities to augment what a health professional might be able to do. And at the same time, colleagues of mine are doing some research to recognizing, working with clinical data and administrative data, that in fact, with certain populations with complex chronic conditions, it's the social data, which they can't get their hands on, that's probably going to be the most likely to lead to improvement in outcomes. And so on the one hand, there's an emerging worry that in fact, if you use the data that you have, you might actually bias towards particular type of healthcare clinical outcomes, when in fact, what we really need in order to improve health outcomes is social innovation. Addressing health equity gaps. I do some work in the global health space, and we recognize differences in capacity. One of the questions that arises is whether or not AI will help to bridge some of those health and social inequities, or some of those gaps. And it's an open question right now, but it's a ripe area for work for us all. And then finally, I'm in a school of public health, and so we've been reflecting on how might AI methods actually be used to help better serve health services planning, public policy development in order to better meet needs. So those seem to be the hot areas right now, particularly in the health space, where there seem to be opportunities. But it's also in those spaces that we're seeing, even in the ethics literature, the gray literature, and also from our colleagues, that some ethical questions are emerging. So we've already heard today, about a year or so, colleagues of mine at the Vector Institute and I were asked, okay, so what are the ethical issues? And this summarizes some of the questions that we were encountering, and we've heard many of them today, so we needn't retrace them. But one of the things that we didn't hear so much today was about the implications for, in the healthcare space, for health workers. So for particular physician groups are concerned about how their roles may be displaced by virtue of some of these technologies moving into the space. Radiologists, pathologists in particular are worrying, well, what does this mean for our profession if the machine can actually do better work than we can? And on the other hand, you've got primary care docs saying, how might this be augmenting what I might be able to offer? And so within the health professions, there are questions emerging about what does this mean? But not only that, but what might this mean too for the training of health professionals down working backwards as well. So these are the questions that are challenging us right now in terms of thinking about curriculum design, not only of research, in research, and then also in the development of these applications. So we might ask ourselves, how might we be able to advance AI in health to achieve its promises without some of the perils that might come with it? One thing we might contemplate is that many of the perils that might emerge aren't really tied to the technology itself or the method itself, although we've canvassed a number of these ethical concerns already about bias and so on. It's also in the implementation. It's implementing these technologies within a living ecosystem of relationships and interactions, human interactions, institutional interactions, that themselves call our attention, because those promise of AI will never be realized if it's let go into the wild, as they say, into an environment that is not receptive, that is not prepared, and we might actually see absurd outcomes arising as a result. So we've identified with our team at the Joint Center for Bioethics, based on some of our consultations, some of our own scanning work, identified 4 priority areas that we're working on right now with our partners. One is in the area of AI and the future of caring. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the startups in various different areas related to caring, but it's prompted questions about, what is the introduction of these types of technologies going to do to the patient-provider relationship, and how can we ensure that we continue to provide compassionate and equitable care whilst also taking advantage of these technologies. One critical gap that we've identified is that very often there's so much experimentation going on in this area, and it's exciting, that at the same time we're not having a conversation about what's the future that we're working toward. What are the possible futures for health, particularly health understood broadly, even beyond healthcare, that we would, as a society, be aspiring toward? And so with colleagues with the Brookfield Institute, CFAR, and my colleague Jay Shaw back here, we're starting to scope out some work that is going to be using forecasting methods to be able to try to identify what would those scenarios be, and embedded within that, what are the values that really seem to animate those futures. And because with that in mind, to Alison's point, we might be able to get a better read on what is permissible in Canada with Canadians. Public trust of AI, obviously, we've heard a great deal about that from Alison, but I just wanted to offer a little thought experiment about this. So looking at some recent public opinion polling data about trust in Canada amongst and who Canadians trust, high level of trust for healthcare organizations and universities, lots of, in the health space, tons of work on AI happening in that space. AI companies, a little bit lower trust, we might say, well, it's because we don't really know what they are yet. So as Canadians, we're like, I don't know if I trust them yet. They have to demonstrate. But as you'll note, and we saw this in the polling we did here, insurance companies receive lower levels of trust. So if you're a health organization, you are working with a bank of trust to be able to experiment with some of these new technologies and to work with that. But you also have a steeper hill to fall down, right? Life insurance companies have a steeper hill to climb. And so what question we might ask ourselves, and a question we're asking ourselves, is what are the conditions of trust for the introduction at this particular moment of introducing AI technologies into the health space? The answer to that question may be quite different than it is from 5 years from now with some experience, or 10 years from now. So what is it right now at this really generative, novel, early day in terms of AI in health that we really need to better understand what the conditions of trust are? And it may be about privacy and it may be about consent, but my suspicion is it's going to be about other things as well that are critical. This leads to the third area that really speaks to ethical governance of AI. And so we're finding in many of our health institutions, they're struggling to figure out which data governance model from an ethics perspective ought to be used. And in fact, one of my colleagues was who's a geneticist, was hoping to do some facial recognition research, trying to see whether or not the facial recognition software would actually be a better diagnostic tool than actually some of the genetic testing. It might be an aid to some of the work that she was doing. And she, with some advice from colleagues, elected to go through, in her hospital, through an approval process using a quality improvement approach, being told that the Research Ethics Board would just slow things down. Turns out, 18 months later, she finally received approval to proceed with this and realized that part of the problem was the institution didn't know how to respond. They didn't know how to balance their legal obligations. They'd never encountered this type of research before to this extent. They were worried about liability. They were worried about the use of proprietary software from elsewhere. And there's this governance, sort of emerging governance gap, particularly within the academic health science setting, about which governance model should be the one that should be dictating how we proceed with with innovation in this area. But the second area of governance that I think is creating some novel complexities for us is just the number of actors in this space in a way that we haven't seen with other types of technologies. Artificial intelligence-based technologies are ubiquitous. You and I, regardless if we go into a bank or if we actually, if you think about insurance companies, maybe they're moving into that space. We've got hospitals in this space. We've got universities in this space. It's all around. And that's something that we haven't seen, say, with the introduction of genetic technology. So the multiple actors in this space is starting to raise questions about what's the appropriate way to govern those. And I heard somebody, a vice president of a hospital, say, we just need better legal agreements. But we knew from what happened with the Royal Free Hospital in the UK was that legal agreements were not by themselves going to be sufficient to establish a basis for ethical governance. And so that's, it reinforces we need to be thinking differently about what the nature of these relationships and partnerships are, especially since we know that there are often competing goals, commercial goals versus public sector, what we'd see as public sector or public interest goals, maybe competing values, competing interests and competing incentives. And all of those will be operative at the point of determining how we will partner and move together. And then finally, and this will be the last thematic area, consistently questions arising about equity and digital divide. We've heard about equity-related concerns about bias, but on a broader scale, this is a graphic that one of my research assistants put together, just showing mapping out where the intensity of investment, both of academic investment and also financial investment, is going in AI. And you can start to see that the darker red is signaling high levels of intensive investment of a variety of kinds. And the rest of the lighter pink areas are areas that are not investing in the same sort of way, which raises the question, are we inadvertently creating conditions where we're exacerbating existing global equity divides that are already there? We've heard about inequities between patient groups that are more powerful than others. We've also got health institutions that have greater internal capacity compared to others. And so we need to be attentive to that as well in order to prevent potential new inequities. So this is work that, of course, cannot be undertaken by a single ethics center all on its own. So I just want to acknowledge some of the collaborations that we have right now. The ones that I can speak to, which include within our school, the Vector Institute, Public Health Ontario, Population Health Analytics Lab, also at the University of Toronto. But in addition, the World Health Organization, and increasingly, we're starting to, through all of the networks of these groups being brought together, we can start to see where we can create a crucible to work through these issues together, because this is going to be cross-disciplinary work for sure. So I will just leave it there, just again, some reflections through the lens of somebody working in healthcare, some of the issues that we're hearing that are urgent to add to what we've already been hearing today. So thank you.